Does improving your flexibility improve your function? There's this conception out there that if you become more flexible, your function also improves as well. And so in order to improve your function, you need to improve your flexibility, especially as you age. On today's episode of the Exercise is Health podcast, we are going to be exploring this question and really diving into this question of, do you need to become more flexible in order for your body to function better? We're going to cue the intro song and then we're going to dive right into this conversation. Welcome to the Exercise is Health podcast, where we're talking about exercise, health, and the interconnectedness of the two. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we will be coming to you every single week from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg. Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Charlie. Before we dive into this week's episode, I want to let you know that we recently released a book called The Exercise for Life Method. And if you enjoy the conversations that we have every single week on this podcast, then you are going to love this book. So to pick up a free copy of this book, all you have to do is go to exerciseforlifemethod.com. Now, without further ado, let's dive into this week's episode. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the Exercise is Health podcast. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we're coming to you from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg, here in Schaumburg, Illinois, where we believe that your health is your most valuable asset, and the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise is geared towards building the health and function of your muscles. Now, so often when people think about exercise, they might think about the running or the lifting the weights or doing the class. And a lot of times they also think about stretching or mobility work or foam rolling or other things to try to improve not only how much your joints are moving, but this idea of flexibility, with the thought behind it being, well, if I'm moving better, if my joints are able to move better, and if I'm more flexible, then the function of my body must be higher. And especially as people age, one thing that they often notice is that their flexibility tends to decrease. And this is often thought to be associated with a decrease in function as well. And so then the thought becomes, well, if I can improve my flexibility, my function will naturally improve too. And so on today's episode, we want to explore these thoughts and really dive into the question of, does improving your flexibility actually improve your function? Or are they two separate things, and which should you be focusing on as you age?
Charlie, this is such a hot topic for people that are aging and they feel like, I need to now do something to keep my functionality, meaning keep my ability to do the stuff that I want to do. And it's usually not associated with working out or sports, but more associated with like, hey, I want to get on the floor and get up off the floor with my grandkids, or I want to feel confident walking around the grocery store and reaching up and getting stuff off the top shelf. I want to be able to twist around in my car and look to see my dog in the back seat. It's that kind of stuff that I hear this conversation come up. And I was actually just recently talking to a client about this, and it's been something that has been on my radar for the whole time we've been trainers, but it's always good when clients bring it up, because then I remember like, oh yeah, just because I'm in my own little bubble of how we think, and this podcast is a bubble of how we think, I forget what, I don't want to say outsiders, but what outsiders think, or what the normal population thinks. And my client was very concerned that she was losing flexibility in one of the areas of her body. She was also worried that I had asked her to stop stretching a certain area of her body, and was worried about the negative repercussions that might bring, because in her mind, stretching and working on flexibility is what was preserving her functionality. And what we actually talked about was how sometimes if you're losing flexibility, that might be the best way that your body knows how to function at that time. And to improve flexibility and to improve functionality, there might be different routes to address both of these that is not the stretching route. Because let's face it, many times when people are, again, using flexibility to preserve functionality, and remember that usually applies to like activities of daily living, usually that's presented as, hey, the bare minimum to keep yourself functional is to stretch. And I've even heard doctors say that before. And so we have to talk about this, because I don't think the bare minimum to keep your functionality is to stretch. And I actually think there's a much more efficient way a much more potent way to keep your functionality.
Yeah, Julie, one thing that you said that was really powerful there was this idea of, well, if you're losing flexibility, that may actually be your body's best way that it knows how to keep functioning as well as it can. That's such a mind blow for so many people where they're like, what do you mean? Like, me on the outside looking in getting worse is my body's best option right now? Like, how can that be? So we definitely need to explore that more about why that might be and why the traditional idea of just trying to stretch it out may not be the thing that you want to do. But here's the thing. We are all indoctrinated from, the time we're little and we're taking gym class in kindergarten of this idea of you need to stretch. If you can't touch your toes, that means you need to stretch more. And if you can touch your toes, well, then you need to keep stretching to make sure you can keep touching your toes, as if touching your toes had any significance whatsoever, right? So the idea is that, we are indoctrinated into this exercise world, into this fitness world, into this workout and sports world where stretching has such a large emphasis placed on it. The importance of it, the necessity of it to, allegedly prevent injuries and, make sure you stay moving well and everything like that. And then that story continues on as you age, where when you start to feel tight, it's like, okay, well then, your hamstrings need to be stretched or your low back needs to be stretched. If you've been sitting at your desk for a while, you might have tight hip flexors, so you need to stretch those out. And then as you get older and older and older, it's like, well, now you're really starting to lose motion. So you really need to put an emphasis on stretching. And it's like, you've been stretching your entire life. Why is it then that your motion keeps decreasing? Why is it that you keep feeling tight? Why is it that all the alleged benefits that you're supposed to get from stretching aren't being seen? And it's not just that, well, I'm just not stretching enough. Like, I stretch this much, but I know I should do more. Like, that's people's default, right? So let's explore this, because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about the role that stretching could play in actually improving your function.
Now, when we think about stretching, there's a pretty clear outcome goal that we have. And that is that we have our current body moving however it's moving, and we want it to be able to move more or move more fluidly. So if we don't even think about the process of getting there, just think about what you want out of stretching, right? Being more functional, which oftentimes will mean you can move better, you can move more fluidly, you feel less choppy or feel smoother when you move, all that stuff. That's the outcome that you want. And then we put the vehicle in there, and that vehicle is oftentimes stretching, sometimes it's massaging, things like that. But actually, what we find is that your body will often create lack of mobility, lack of flexibility, lack of smooth movement feeling or feeling good when you move due to lack of stability. So your body is constantly trying to monitor what's going on inside, and it's always going to default. Its number one thing is to protect you. So its default is protection. And the way your body can oftentimes protect you is to create tight muscles or limited motion or choppy motion, because it's a good way to get your attention, right? Like when you get up and you have tight hamstrings, you're like, wow, my hamstrings are tight. You know right away that your hamstrings are tight. And that's kind of the purpose of having tight hamstrings. It's your body's way of telling you, hey, we got to pull back the reins on this situation here. And so again, when we're trying to have the outcome goal of, hey, I need to do something to create more function in this area, create more flexibility, create more mobility, however you want to label that, we always put that vehicle in there that is stretching. And what's interesting is that we find that a lot of people do a lot of stretching and a lot of people never get to that outcome goal, but they're fixated on that process of the stretching. But what we do find is that when people do strengthening exercises to build stability in your body, although it seems like, wait, how would that lead me to where I want to go? We often find that that's a more efficient and effective vehicle to getting you to more functional, more flexible, more ease of motion, more, I guess, a symptom-free motion, because your body's not giving you signals when you're moving. That's how we kind of know you're moving well, is like when you can move and you don't think about it. So anyways, we often find that doing strengthening, stability work really helps and is more efficient than using flexibility to encourage functionality.
Yeah, that is exactly right. And these concepts were initially proposed to us in Greg Roscoff's Muscle Activation Techniques program, and we've seen them really develop over the last 10 plus years when working with clients in this manner, where we're focusing on improving strength and we're focusing on, like you're saying, Julie, improving the stability of things. We had a client come in just this past week, and she had a total knee replacement done, and there was an issue with the bending and the straightening of the knee. And that's not uncommon after a surgery like a total knee replacement. But, she had finished up her rounds of PT, and the primary focus during that time was on the stretching aspect of things. And so, when she finished, her motion was what it was. And there was this idea out there of like, well, if you don't get to your full range of motion by, the 6-month mark, it's just not coming back. And so this idea was kind of placed in her head, right? So there's this sense of urgency of like, we need to get this motion back. Well, what we've seen, one, it's been past the 6-month mark, but two, by strictly focusing on doing strengthening exercises for her, on making sure her muscles are contracting well, and then following that up with very specific and very strategic resistance training for her muscles, her motion continues to improve, continues to get better every single week. And we haven't done a bit of stretching with her at all, but we continue to see motion improvements, and more importantly, we continue to see function improvements through focusing on improving the strength of the muscles that would bend and straighten her knee.
Yeah, I love that story because, sometimes when there's like these blanket statements like, oh, you need to get full range of motion before 6 months, and whatever you get by 6 months, you're not getting any more. Well, I always wonder, okay, well, with what process? Meaning like with the process that you're giving, which I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it's biased. Just like Charlie and I are biased towards, strength and stability and our ideas on exercise. There are different fields that have biases towards not that. And a lot of times it's towards stretching and mobility. And so the idea that was really presented to this post-knee surgery client is that first, let's get mobility. Then let's make stability. Because I think we all know, like, hey, well, maybe we don't all know. And what we're talking about is saying, first, let's get stability. And stability is what breeds mobility. Meaning the more that your body is stable, the more your body is strong, the more that your body will allow you to move and be functional. I think a really clear picture of this is when you're injured. If you think about a muscle can be like 100% and then a muscle can be 0%. We're all on this spectrum of like, how good is your muscle today? And the lower percentage of your muscle, the more it would be injured, right? So like if you sprain an ankle, all the muscles around your ankle would be, pretty frazzled, whatever. If you think about how functional is your ankle, well, you can't walk on it. Can barely wiggle it around and move it. And if you do, it really hurts. And also, as you can see, you can't do the stuff that an ankle normally does. It's also very weak. When muscles are not functioning well, they will oftentimes limit your motion and be very weak. And what happens is that if we start forcing motion into these very vulnerable, weak areas, well, then we still don't have strength in these areas. And if we were to say, okay, well, let me just get this ankle to move and then send you off walking, well, now there's this huge opportunity for further injury to the area because we have yet to bring about strength and stability. The other way would be, hey, we have these muscles that aren't working well. Let's create strength and stability in them. And then what happens is that your body will often allow as much motion as it is able to stabilize, meaning it will stop itself. Like there's a self-regulating thing. Now, I'm not saying we're talking about injury today, but I think it's a good idea in terms of like when we think of the extreme, we can also apply that to less extreme. So if there's areas of your body that are like, hey, I need to improve the flexibility here, or I need to be improving in flexibility everywhere in my body, I'm just tight everywhere. Well, if you start working on the strength and stability of things, then your body will allow as much motion as it will feel that it is stable in, meaning as much motion as it can protect you from injury from.
Exactly. Now, all right, so how does this relate back to flexibility and coming back to stretching and whatnot? Well, the idea that we're trying to lay out today is that, look, if your flexibility is limited, you might not need to do the traditional things that are thought of to improve your flexibility. You might not need to do the stretching. You might not need to do the rolling. You might not need to do the mobility work, because instead you can actually focus on strengthening. You can actually focus on trying to help your muscles function better. And when they function better, your muscles will be able to move your joints better. In other words, you'll be able to become more flexible, and you won't have to stretch. You won't have to do any of the mobility work. You won't have to do any of the rolling, but you'll be able to improve and maintain your flexibility without sacrificing the strength, without sacrificing your stability, and without sacrificing the integrity of the joint from an injury prevention perspective. And so that's a really big thing, because think about what happens to people as they age. Do they usually get stronger or weaker? Well, throughout the early part of our lives, we're generally all getting stronger. And then at some point, that natural improvement stops, and we have to start working really hard in order to just maintain, because the natural swing of things is that we start getting weaker. And so if we don't do anything over time, we get weaker. Our muscles don't function as well. And so because of that, if we can say, well, I'm going to focus on stretching to improve my flexibility, and instead say I'm going to focus on strengthening to improve my flexibility, now all of a sudden, we actually get to take care of two potential issues with one solution, where you're doing strengthening type exercises, but you're moving better as a result. Yes, you're getting the improvements in strength, but you're also getting the improvements in joint motion and flexibility. And so overall, that leads to improvements in function.
Absolutely. I love where you left that off, Charlie, where working on strength, working on stability leads to mobility, leads to flexibility, leads to functionality. So if your goal is to stay as functional as possible, we really encourage you to start working on resistance training and regular resistance training for all your areas, all your muscles, because that is what's going to lead to the highest functioning of your body. Now, that might not make sense for you, but I dare you to try it, especially because so many times we hear, oh, I'm losing mobility, let's stretch. And it doesn't matter the outcome. What matters is that you felt like you wanted to stretch, so you did it. And if you got more flexible, great. If you didn't, great. But I challenge you, next time you're like, wow, I feel like I'm losing mobility here. Something's not working right. Something's feeling weird. I challenge you to try resistance training. If you don't regularly resistance train, well, then just do that body part. And more often than not, we find that our clients are improving the function of that area of that joint or whatever you had labeled not flexible or losing mobility. And oftentimes it's more longer lasting results because you're building stability in your muscles. You're not asking your body to relax more and to turn off more muscles. So definitely give it a try if you haven't yet. And if you're needing more tips on how to resistance train, almost every podcast, we somehow talk about it. So make sure you listen to some of our previous podcasts on the hows of resistance training.
Yeah, Julie, that's a really great point, because the caveat that needs to be thrown in is it's not just doing resistance training that's a thing, but it needs to be appropriate for your body. And actually, we just finished up our one workout away challenge where we focused on really using this idea of improving strength to improve motion and to improve the health of joints. And what we saw across the board is over the course of the 28 days, people were moving better, people were stronger, people were functioning better, and it wasn't through doing stretching. So yeah, definitely go back to listen to earlier episodes that we've put out, as well as future episodes, because we're going to come back to it as well. But just the ideas of, like making sure you're body matching your exercise, making sure you're focusing on your muscles squeezing while you're doing the exercise. Those are really big things that most of the fitness world completely neglects. So a lot of times when people think about doing resistance training, they think about, doing the heavy squats or doing the deadlifts or things like that. And that's not what we're talking about. So definitely go back to previous episodes to get a clearer idea of how to go about doing your resistance training.
I'm so glad you said that, because as soon as you started talking, I did think, Oh yeah, like if someone's not familiar with our content, they're thinking, oh, so the suggestion when I'm feeling not functional is to go do resistance training. And what if when I say resistance training, the picture that pops in your head is like the powerlifters or CrossFit or, alpha athlete training or whatever. It's not that. And if you're listening to this and you like to be into your workouts a little bit more, it's also not like senior citizen workouts. Like it's not like only made for old people. It's made for everyone that has a body. And what we suggest is that you exercise in this manner at least a few times a week. And then if you're more into like the athletic stuff, then you can add that on. But remember how in the beginning I said people feel like the baseline of keeping functionality is stretching? The baseline of keeping functionality is regular, appropriate resistance training.
So if you're feeling like your function is decreasing as you age and you are blaming a loss of flexibility as a cause of that, we want to invite you to rethink how you're approaching addressing the issue of the loss of flexibility. Are you going about it strictly by stretching and the traditional forms of trying to improve flexibility? Or would you be open to also including some resistance training or focusing solely on resistance training that's appropriate for your body and specific to what your body actually needs? We find across the board when people do the latter, not only does their flexibility improve, but their function greatly improves as well. So who do you know that needs to hear this episode? Who do you know that is really into doing the traditional methods of trying to improve flexibility, but they're just not getting the results that they would like, and they feel like their body's function is decreasing because of that? Share this episode with them so they can learn about another approach that could be super useful to helping them not only improve their flexibility, but improve their function as well. And while you're online, head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. It helps people find this episode when they're looking for information on exercise and when they're looking for information on health. So if you found value in this conversation today, let us know by leaving us that 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week. So how'd you like that episode? Did you find the information useful? If you enjoyed what we discussed today, then you are going to love the Exercise for Life method, which is a book that we just put out and you can get a free copy of by going to exerciseforlifemethod.com. All we ask is that you pay for shipping and handling. So head there now and get your free copy, as well as some exclusive bonuses that you will get instant access to when you get the book. You can learn more and get your copy at exerciseforlifemethod.com. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Gates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.